No one wanted to touch the smelly alien girl. So I took her home for stand under the shower. What if love didn't start with a heartbeat, but from the deepest corners of space? What if the person you were destined to love wasn't even human? A question no one in the galaxy was brave enough to answer until he found himself standing in front of her. A broken alien, discarded in a dying sector. Her body bruised, her mind fractured, but her eyes glowed like silver moons in the darkness, watching him waiting. And in that moment, something changed. In Sector 42X, a forgotten place, a forgotten world, he was just trying to survive. Delivering supplies, keeping his head down, but the universe had a cruel sense of humor. She was the galaxy's castaway, a broken soul whose past was as much a mystery to him as the strange, unmarked stars in the sky. No one cared about her. No one even looked. But something in him couldn't just walk away. He didn't know why. Was it sympathy? A past he couldn't escape? Or could it be that love, no, something more, was calling him to her? Will love survive when it's a choice that defies every rule in the universe? Could this woman, this alien, change everything he thought he knew about love and about life itself? Stay with us, because the answer is buried within this broken galaxy. And as we embark on this journey, remember, this story will break every rule you thought you knew about love. Watch till the end to discover how. You don't want to miss it? Don't forget to hit subscribe. The first 1000 to join will be part of something unforgettable. The wind in wasted sector always smelled of burnt plastic and faded memories. A place no one cared about. Forgotten. In the deep, forgotten outskirts of the universe, the sound of desperate survival echoed through the rusted walls. Dererick hadn't meant to stop. It wasn't part of his job. But something caught his eye. A woman. Or what looked like one. She was crumpled on the ground, lying as if the very earth had swallowed her whole. Her skin, a deep, shimmering green, caught the dim light, reflecting it like the last ray of hope. Her face symmetrical, too perfect, too beautiful, was almost unreal. Her ears were long, slightly curved. She looked so out of place. And yet, no one cared. No one moved to help. Why? Hey, Dererick said, barely above the hum of the broken wind, his voice gruff. Can you hear me? She didn't move. Didn't flinch. Her eyes were empty, staring into nothing. But her lips, they trembled. A slight shiver. And in that second, he knew, she wasn't gone. Not yet. He stepped closer. Still, no response. What was this? The locals, those few still awake and alive, ignored her. They had seen too many broken souls to care. Dererick, though, something tugged at him. He crouched beside her, pulling his coat from his shoulders, laying it across her. Her skin was cold, harder than he expected. A shiver ran through him as his fingers brushed against hers. The coldness, it felt wrong. But there was no time to think. He needed to get her out of there. He lifted her gently. She didn't resist, didn't cry out, just went limp. Featherlight. Fragile. He carried her past the gazes of the locals, none daring to speak or intervene. She didn't belong here. She couldn't belong here. His truck hummed in the distance as he set her down on the seat. No words. Not a single one. She simply curled against the seat, eyes half closed. Who was she? Where did she come from? He wasn't the kind of man to play hero. not anymore. He used to be, once. But that was before the war. Before the endless loss. As the truck rumbled down the worn-out road, Dererick couldn't help but glance at her. She reminded him of someone he once cared for. His sister. She had been 12 when the attack came. She never made it out. The memory hit him like a blade. He had failed her then. And yet, here he was, failing to ignore the woman beside him. No, not failing. He wasn't going to fail her. Not again. Dererick's outpost was nothing special, just a reinforced shed on the outskirts of a forgotten sector, surrounded by the hum of machinery that had long given up trying to be useful. The only thing that worked properly here was the broken silence. But as Dererick carried her inside, the quiet was different. She was different. He laid her down gently on the cot, the faint hum of the old heating unit buzzing in the background. She didn't move, not even a twitch. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. He studied her face, the sharpness of her features, her alien beauty. There was something about her, something so unfamiliar yet familiar, like a memory from a dream long forgotten. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. What am I doing? He set to work, though he didn't know what for. He checked the systems, adjusted a few things here and there, all while stealing glances at her. What had happened to her? Why was she here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? His thoughts spiraled out of control as his hands moved mechanically. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't qualified to fix her. But she was here, and he couldn't just let her. He couldn't leave her alone. The thought of it made his chest tighten. Finally, he stood up and approached her cautiously, a small tray of water and some ration bars in his hand. The silence in the room was deafening, almost suffocating. He set the tray down beside her, his eyes still watching. Still nothing. Hey, he whispered, unsure if she could even hear him. I don't know what happened to you, but I'm not gonna leave you here to rot. Her eyes fluttered, and for the first time, she moved just a little. Her fingers twitched, brushing against the edge of the blanket. Can you hear me? Dererick asked again, his voice barely audible. Her eyes opened a fraction, not to look at him, but to look past him. Her gaze was distant, as if focused on something that wasn't there. He frowned. Who are you? The question lingered in his mind, unanswered. She didn't speak. Instead, she took a shallow breath, and slowly, ever so slowly, her hand stretched towards the water tray. She didn't touch it, just hovered over it, fingers trembling. Dererick sat back down, unsure of what to do next. He didn't want to crowd her. Didn't want to push too hard. But he also knew she needed something. Needed help. The silence stretched on, but it was no longer oppressive. It felt almost like an invitation. Something unspoken, shared between them. After a long while, she reached for the water. He didn't move. Didn't speak. The quietness between them felt significant. There was something almost sacred in it. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was making a choice. She wants to live. Dererick exhaled, the weight of that realization settling deep in his bones. He glanced down at his own hands, calloused from years of hard work, of mechanical repairs, of fixing things that were broken. But this was different. She wasn't a broken machine. She was a person, and yet, she was far more than that. He couldn't even begin to understand what had happened to her. What kind of world had abandoned her like this? His mind returned to the long years he'd spent in the Outer Rim, to the dark, forgotten corners of the galaxy where people like him went when they had nothing left to lose. But she wasn't from here. She couldn't be. The silence lingered as he sat there, watching her slowly drink, her eyes never leaving him. Slowly, the tension in his chest eased. She was still here. Still alive. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust him. He wasn't sure how long the night stretched on, but it felt like hours. He sat, keeping his distance, never breaking the quiet. The walls of the small shed creaked and groaned as the wind outside picked up. His thoughts wandered, but he didn't let himself slip too deep. Not yet. He had a duty to her now, whether he wanted it or not. And somehow, despite everything, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice. Dererick spent the night in his usual quiet way. The hum of the power unit, the occasional hiss of air vents, and the soft murmur of the wind outside filled the silence around him. But something was different now. The air inside felt warmer, more alive, as though the space itself was waking up after years of slumber. He couldn't help but keep an eye on her, even though she was still in the same position, curled on the cot, barely moving. His mind raced. Who was she? Where did she come from? What had happened to her to leave her in this state? These questions gnawed at him, but no answers came. He wasn't a stranger to secrets. Hell, he had his own, but this was different. This woman, this alien, wasn't just a casualty of the galaxy's indifference. She was something more. He could feel it in the way her presence filled the room. She wasn't just broken. She was waiting. The next morning, when the low light of the sun filtered in through the small, cracked window, Dererick found himself still staring at her. She hadn't moved all night, except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. He couldn't stop watching her. He didn't know why. "Are you gonna wake up anytime soon?" he muttered, mostly to himself. He set about his routine, preparing a quick breakfast, trying to ignore the tension building in his chest. The kitchen was a mess, but it was his mess. His space. He was used to it. But today, it felt different. The soft scrape of a spoon against the bowl, the quiet clink of metal, it all felt distant. Like his world, for just a moment, had been thrown off balance. Suddenly, there was movement. A subtle shift. The woman, no, the girl, he corrected himself, noticing the delicate features of her face slowly stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. The silver hue that had been faint yesterday was now unmistakable. Those eyes, they weren't human. But then again, she wasn't human. He stopped mid-motion, the spoon still hovering near the bowl. For a second, neither of them moved. She blinked, slowly taking in her surroundings. Her gaze flicked around the room, lingering for a moment on the walls, the clutter, the poor excuse for a bed. But she didn't seem frightened. No. She didn't seem anything at all. Just confused. She looked at him. Her eyes didn't falter, didn't shift away. There was something oddly piercing about her gaze, as though she was reading him, not just his face, but his thoughts, his very soul. And then, nothing. A long silence. "Good morning," he said, as if it were normal. "You sleep okay?" She didn't answer, but the way her eyes lingered on him told him she was processing the words. "You're safe here," Dererick continued, trying to ease the tension. "I won't hurt you. I'm just trying to help." She didn't nod, didn't move, but her expression softened ever so slightly. It was enough for him to keep going. "Yeah, not much of a luxury suite, I know," he said with a weak smile, attempting to break the ice. "But it's all I got." Her gaze shifted to the table beside the cot, where he'd placed a small tray of water and food. She didn't touch it, but her eyes moved over it with a careful curiosity. Her lips parted, as though she might speak, but she didn't. Dererick hesitated, unsure of what to do. She was so still. So distant. Yet, there was something magnetic about her. Something that pulled him in deeper than he was comfortable with. "I can't promise I have all the answers," he said, taking a deep breath. "But I'll be here. And if you need anything, just let me know." Silence again. But it wasn't heavy. It was softer. She wasn't afraid. Not yet, at least. Dererick felt the weight of the unspoken words between them, the sense of something slowly shifting. What was happening here? Why was he doing this? He hadn't planned on being some kind of savior, but here they were. He turned back to his workbench and began fiddling with the tools, his movements slow and deliberate. It wasn't until he heard the sound of her shifting on the cot that he glanced up. She had sat up. Slowly, tentatively, but she was sitting. His breath caught in his throat. This was progress. Small, but it was something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was choosing to move forward. For the first time since she arrived, she made eye contact with him. It wasn't the vacant stare of a person lost in their mind. It wasn't the distant gaze of someone who couldn't remember what it meant to be human. No. This was different. She was seeing him. Really seeing him. Dererick's heart skipped a beat. "Hey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You gonna be alright?" She didn't answer, but she did something that shocked him. She reached out. Not toward the water. Not toward the food. She reached for him. Her hand hovered in the air for a moment, trembling slightly. And then, without warning, she pressed her palm gently against his. The touch wasn't forceful. It wasn't desperate. It was delicate. Hesitant. But real. He froze. Her touch sent a shock through his body, as though something inside him had come alive. He didn't know what to do, so he just stayed still, letting the moment stretch out. "I won't hurt you," he said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. And for the first time, he thought he might have been telling the truth. Not just to her but to himself. The silence stretched between them like a fragile thread, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind of silence. It was more like the quiet of two people finally acknowledging that they were no longer strangers, even if neither of them fully understood why. Dererick's heart was still racing from the brief, tender touch, and he had to force himself to look away. There was something in the air now. Something unspoken. Something that made the world outside their shelter feel distant, almost irrelevant. She slowly withdrew her hand, her fingers brushing lightly against his as she let go. The contact was fleeting, but it felt like an eternity. For a long moment, she didn't speak, her eyes downcast. It was as though she was lost in thought, contemplating something far beyond the walls of this run-down outpost. Dererick didn't press her to speak. He wasn't sure what he expected. She was still so broken, so distant, and yet, there was a flicker in her gaze now. A spark of something. Was it hope? He tried to focus on his workbench, but the weight of her presence was hard to ignore. Every time he looked up, She was still there, seated on the cot, her posture less defensive than it had been, less closed off. And then, without warning, she moved. Slowly. Deliberately. She swung her legs off the cot and stood, her bare feet making soft, careful steps toward the window. Dererick's breath caught in his throat. She was moving. Really moving. "Where are you going?" he asked, unable to keep the worry out of his voice. She didn't respond. But that wasn't unusual. She hadn't spoken since he found her, and maybe that was okay. Maybe the silence between them was all they needed for now. But something about her energy felt different. She wasn't the same broken, fragile creature from before. She was standing taller now. Stronger. Dererick rose to his feet, a mix of curiosity and caution flooding his chest. He didn't want to intrude on whatever moment this was for her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. He had to know if she was okay. She reached the window and pressed her hands against the cold, cracked glass. Her eyes fixed on the bleak landscape outside, the same empty streets, the same polluted sky. But there was a change in her expression. Not sadness. Not fear. There was something else. Something almost peaceful. "Do you want to talk about it?" Dererick asked again, his voice softer this time, but still filled with that same concern. She didn't respond. But she didn't need to. Her fingers lingered on the window frame, and for a long moment, they both stood there in silence, watching the stillness of Sector 8 outside. The world was broken, but inside this small room, something was beginning to heal. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, low, but there was strength in it. "I don't know who I am anymore." Her words hit Dererick like a punch to the gut. He wasn't sure what she meant, but he understood the weight of it. He understood the feeling of losing yourself. Of feeling like you're someone else, someone you don't recognize. "I'm not sure I do either," he replied, his voice steady despite the surge of emotion in his chest. "But you're here. That's something. You don't have to figure it all out right now." She didn't look at him, but the tension in her shoulders relaxed slightly. There was a soft sigh, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make Dererick's heart beat a little easier. "Do you want to stay here?" he asked, not because he was trying to force anything, but because he wanted to offer her a choice. A chance to decide. She turned to him then, and for the first time since he'd found her, she really looked at him. Her silver eyes were full of questions, but there was something else there, too. Maybe it was trust. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. "I don't know if I can stay," she whispered, "but I don't want to leave." And in that moment, Dererick realized something. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were both trying to live. Trying to find a way forward. "You don't have to leave," he said firmly, walking over to her. He reached out, not to touch, but to stand beside her. "You can stay as long as you need." She didn't say anything, but she didn't pull away either. And for the first time in days, Dererick felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and quiet tension. Outside, the howling winds of Sector 8 rattled the walls of Dererick's shelter, but inside, the only sound was the occasional flicker of the power grid and the hum of the heating unit struggling to maintain warmth. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the two of them to exist in this fragile space between silence and something deeper. Dererick sat at his workbench, the scattered tools and parts before him a familiar distraction. He had always worked alone. The solitude had never bothered him. It was how he preferred it, no need for explanations, no need for anyone else. But now, as he bent over a damaged filtration system, his mind kept drifting back to her. To LRA. She wasn't just another refugee. She wasn't just another broken soul who had been discarded by the galaxy. She was something more. He could feel it in the way she moved now, the way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. Her eyes were no longer distant, not in the same way they had been when he first found her. They were curious, questioning, even a little hopeful. And yet, she was still broken. Still scarred by the past, by the things that had been done to her. The horrors she had endured. Dererick knew it wasn't something he could fix. He wasn't a healer, he wasn't a soldier, he was just a mechanic. A guy with a truck and a toolkit. But maybe, just maybe, he could offer her something that was even more important. A place. A choice. A chance to heal in her own time. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of her moving. He looked up and saw her standing near the cot, her back to the wall, eyes locked on the window. The same place where she had stood earlier, watching the world outside. But this time, there was something different in her posture. It was like she was ready for something. Ready to make a decision. "Are you okay?" Dererick asked, his voice low, cautious. He didn't want to intrude, but he couldn't ignore the shift in her presence. LRA turned slowly, her gaze meeting his. There was something almost serene in her expression now, something that had been missing before. She took a step forward, crossing the room with an unfamiliar confidence. The distance between them felt charged, as if every step she took brought them closer to something. To a decision. To an answer. "I've been running for so long," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "From everything. From myself. From the people who did this to me. From this place." She gestured vaguely at the shelter, at the ruins outside, at the life she had been forced to endure. "I don't know if I can keep running anymore." Dererick swallowed, his throat tight. He had always known what it felt like to escape. To try to outrun the past, the ghosts that haunted your every step. But he had never felt it like she did. He had never had to run from who he was, from who he had been. "You don't have to run anymore," he said, his voice steady. "You can stay here. With me. No pressure. No questions. Just stay." Her eyes softened, just a little. She stepped closer, until they were standing just a few feet apart. The space between them seemed to shrink with every passing second, as if the world itself was drawing them together. "You're offering me a choice," she said, her gaze flicking to the floor before meeting his again. "But I don't know if I'm ready to choose. I don't know what's left of me to choose from." Dererick reached out, not to touch her, but just to offer his presence. It was enough to say, "I'm here." And that was all he could give her. "You don't have to figure it out tonight," he said softly. "You don't have to choose. Not yet." For a long moment, LRA didn't move. But the silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't the silence of fear or confusion. It was the silence of two people standing on the precipice of something new. Something unknown. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible but filled with a strength that made Dererick's chest tighten. "I don't know what's going to happen next," she said. "But I want to stay. I want to see what comes next." A breath he didn't know he was holding escaped his chest, and for the first time since he'd found her, Dererick smiled. It wasn't a grand smile, but it was real. It was a smile that said everything was going to be okay. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're here. And that's enough." And for the first time in days, the weight on his shoulders, the heaviness of all the ghosts he carried, began to lift. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And maybe, just maybe, they could heal together. The next morning, Lyra woke up to the sound of a low hum, a stark contrast to the shrill whine of drones in Sector 8. The wind outside had stopped, leaving an eerie calm that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She could still feel the warm weight of Dererick's hand on her shoulder from last night, the memory of his touch lingering in the quiet. It was strange. Comforting. It was also something she had never allowed herself to feel before. She shifted, the blanket wrapped around her body like a shield. For the first time, it wasn't just a physical barrier, but an emotional one too. She felt safe. She felt real. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't have to brace herself for the next blow, the next command, the next fear. Her fingers brushed the edge of the cot, trembling slightly. She wasn't sure how to process this peace. Dererick's steady breathing could be heard from across the room. He was still asleep, his body stretched out in the corner, a tool in hand, the remains of a drone sprawled across his workbench. She had been awake for a while, but she didn't move, not yet. She didn't want to break the quiet. It had been days since she had let herself think, really think. But now, with her body free of the grime and dirt of Sector 8, she could feel something in her, something waking. Her thoughts were no longer clouded by survival, by running, by fear. She was allowed to be something else now, something that wasn't just a tool. Lyra looked at Dererick. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever, even in this sanctuary. But for now, she chose to stay here. To be with him, in the stillness. She slowly got out of bed, her bare feet making no sound on the cold metal floor. She moved toward the window, looking out at the world she had once known, the world she didn't think she'd ever be able to escape from. But now, it was different. It was just the two of them in this space, this fragile bubble they'd created. And she had a choice. She could choose what came next. Lyra placed her hand on the window, feeling the coolness of the glass beneath her fingertips. The sky was a dull gray, the city beyond still and broken. But there was a peace in that stillness, a peace she had never experienced before. Dererick woke to find her standing by the window, her figure silhouetted against the soft, muted light. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched her, letting her have her space. She wasn't the same person who had been lying on that cot just days ago. She was different. She was starting to believe that she could be more than what others had made her. She wasn't broken. She wasn't a weapon. She was Lyra. Dererick quietly approached her, his footsteps light. He didn't rush. He was starting to understand that this wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about helping her heal. Helping her find herself. He didn't speak right away. He just stood beside her, his presence offering something she had never had before, safety. "You've been through a lot," he said finally, his voice soft, almost hesitant. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. It was hard to put her feelings into words, but she knew one thing now, she wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. "I know," she whispered. Dererick nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. He wasn't sure where this was all leading, but he knew he couldn't walk away now. Not when she had started to trust him. Not when she had started to trust herself. "Let's get to work," he said, his tone light but firm. "We've got a lot to fix." Lyra didn't speak, but there was a softness in her gaze, a quiet acknowledgement. She followed him back to the workbench, her movements no longer hesitant, no longer forced. As they worked together, side by side, Lyra felt a shift inside her. This wasn't just about fixing machines anymore. It was about finding a way to rebuild herself. Piece by piece. Slowly, carefully, but with purpose. And for the first time in years, she felt like she might just be able to do it. The silence that filled the room was no longer uncomfortable, but rather, it had become a companion. The soft hum of the generator and the occasional clink of tools were the only sounds that broke the stillness. Lyra had adjusted to this rhythm, her movements fluid and deliberate, no longer hiding in the corners of the room. She was beginning to feel more like herself slowly, almost imperceptibly. But there was still a restlessness in her, an unresolved piece of herself that lingered just beyond her reach. Dererick noticed it in the way her eyes sometimes wandered to the window, her fingers pausing mid-motion as she lost herself in thoughts he couldn't quite decipher. He had begun to wonder about the past that shaped her, the memories that haunted her, the things she had left behind when she was cast aside by the world. She didn't speak of it. She didn't need to. But he could feel it, like a shadow that followed her, always just out of sight. The drone they had been working on was now fully repaired, its circuits humming to life with a soft, steady whir. Lyra stepped back, wiping a small smear of grease from her hands as she surveyed the small room. The place still felt cramped, filled with remnants of a life neither of them had fully lived, but there was something else now, something that made it feel like home. "How are you holding up?" Dererick asked, his voice breaking through the quiet. Lyra glanced at him, her silver eyes reflecting the light from the drone. For a moment, her lips parted as though she might speak, but then she hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to tell him the truth. She wasn't sure if she could put it into words. "I'm okay," she said softly, her voice steady but not without the weight of something unspoken. Dererick nodded, accepting her answer, though he didn't entirely believe it. He had learned not to press her, at least not yet. But something told him that the deeper questions would come soon. They always did. Lyra's gaze shifted once more, and she moved toward the window, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the frame. The city outside looked as broken as it had the day before, but today, it seemed quieter. Almost as if it were waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for her. It was then that Dererick decided to ask the question that had been on his mind since the night they had shared that silence together. The question he hadn't dared to voice, but that had become louder with each passing day. "Where did you come from, Lyra?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, as though the words might break something fragile between them. Lyra froze, her back to him. Her breath caught in her throat for a split second. She hadn't expected him to ask. She hadn't expected it to matter so much. But it did. "I don't know," she replied, her voice quiet, laced with a sadness she couldn't hide. "I don't remember much, only that I wasn't supposed to be here." The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth that she had buried deep inside. The truth that had kept her silent, kept her running for so long. The truth that had kept her distant from everyone, even Dererick, despite the connection they had slowly built. Dererick took a step closer, his hand resting on the workbench. He didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know how to fix her pain. But he could be here. He could listen. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said, his voice low. "But when you're ready, I'll be here." Lyra turned to face him then, her eyes softer than he had ever seen them before. There was a flicker of something in them, something more than just the guarded soldier she had been. It was a glimpse of the person she might have been before all of this. "I know," she whispered. The moment was delicate. It was fragile. But it was real. And for the first time, Lyra felt something shift inside her. The walls she had built, the barriers she had set between herself and the world, they were beginning to crumble. Not all at once. But just enough for her to feel safe. Just enough for her to feel like maybe, just maybe, she could let someone in. The weight of the past still pressed on her shoulders, but it wasn't as heavy as it used to be. Not with Dererick standing there, offering her the one thing she had never dared to hope for, the chance to heal. The wind outside picked up, rattling the walls of the small shelter, but inside, the warmth was real. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lyra allowed herself to relax. To breathe. To let go, if only for a moment. And Dererick, standing beside her, knew that this was only the beginning. The beginning of something neither of them could predict. But whatever came next, they would face it together. The night settled over the shelter like a blanket, heavy and oppressive, but there was a calmness in the air that had been absent before. Lyra, now more comfortable in her surroundings, sat on the edge of the cot, her fingers tracing the seams of her blanket absent-mindedly. Dererick was at the workbench, carefully sorting through parts, the rhythmic sound of his movements a familiar comfort. The silence between them felt different now, lighter, but still pregnant with the unspoken. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling as it scraped against the walls of the shelter. A faint tremor ran through the floorboards, the vibrations of the distant storms creeping in, reminding them of the world they couldn't escape. But inside, the flickering light of a few worn lamps was enough to create a sense of warmth, a fragile sense of peace. Lyra's eyes flickered to the window once more, her gaze distant, as though she were seeing something far beyond the ruins of the city. Her thoughts were on the unknown, on the shadows that lurked in the back of her mind, the memories that wouldn't let go. She knew there was something more to her past, something she wasn't ready to face. But what was it? And what would happen if she ever remembered? She didn't know. Suddenly, Dererick's voice cut through the stillness, a calm, steady presence in the chaos of her thoughts. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked, his tone casual, but the weight of the question hung in the air. Lyra stiffened, her fingers freezing on the fabric of her blanket. The thought had crossed her mind, of course. Escape. Freedom. The desire to leave this place behind, to find a new life somewhere beyond the walls of Sector 8. But could she? Was she ready to face whatever awaited her outside? "I've thought about it," she replied, her voice low. "But, where would I go?" Dererick leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her. "Anywhere you want," he said simply. "You're not stuck here." Lyra's eyes softened, a flicker of something vulnerable crossing her features. She had never felt this, uncertain before. All her life, she had been on the move, always running, always hiding. The thought of staying, of building something real with Dererick, was both terrifying and comforting. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted. There was a pause, a quiet moment where neither of them spoke, just the sound of their breathing and the hum of the shelter around them. It felt like the universe was holding its breath. waiting for something to break. For something to change. Then, without warning, the sharp sound of a distant engine cut through the silence, followed by the unmistakable whirring of a drone. It was low, close. Too close. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, her body tensing. Dererick stood up immediately, his face paling as he glanced at the small window. The outline of the drone was visible against the gray sky, moving steadily in their direction. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. Lyra's mind raced. It was a surveillance drone. But why was it here? They had done their best to stay off the radar, to remain hidden from the authorities. But something was wrong. Something had changed. Dererick quickly crossed the room, grabbing a small set of tools and pocketing them. His movements were fast but controlled, a man preparing for something he didn't want to face. "Get down," he ordered, his voice firm but low. Lyra didn't need to be told twice. She ducked, crouching behind the workbench as Dererick moved to the door, peeking out through a small crack in the window. The drone was closer now, its dark silhouette cutting through the dim light of the storm. "What the hell do they want?" Dererick muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Lyra's pulse was racing. The thought of being discovered, of the past coming back to haunt her, was too much to bear. She had barely survived this far. What if they found her? What if they took her away again? Without thinking, she moved toward the door, her body tense, every muscle on high alert. Dererick glanced at her, his eyes wide in disbelief. "No. Stay down," he hissed. But Lyra couldn't stay still. The fear inside her had reached a boiling point. She had to know what was going on. She had to see for herself. As she stepped toward the door, her hand brushing against the cold metal of the frame, she froze. A cold, mechanical voice echoed through the storm. "This is a routine inspection," it said. "All residents are required to submit for processing. Failure to comply will result in immediate detainment." Lyra's stomach dropped. Routine inspection? What the hell did that mean? "Dererick," she whispered, her voice shaky. "What do we do?" Dererick's eyes narrowed, his mind working quickly. "We can't let them in," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We're not ready to fight them. But I won't let them take you." There was a fire in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just protecting her. He was protecting their chance at something more. At a future. "We wait," he said quietly. "We stay hidden until they leave." But as the drone hovered closer, the tension between them grew. They couldn't keep running. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The past was catching up to them, and Lyra knew it. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. In that moment, she realized something: she wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was more than that. And she wasn't going to let her past define her future. As the drone passed over their shelter, its sensors scanning the area, Lyra made a choice. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She was ready to fight. The silence was deafening after the drone passed overhead. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched, her eyes glued to the small window. She could hear the faint hum of the drone as it faded into the distance, but the tension in the air lingered. Dererick was still by the door, his posture tense but still. His eyes were on her now, waiting for something, perhaps a sign, a confirmation that she was ready for whatever came next. For the first time since meeting him, Lyra felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking control. Her mind raced back to the moments when she had been nothing but a weapon, a tool for others to use. No more. She wasn't going to let her past dictate her future any longer. And, most importantly, she wasn't going to let herself be scared anymore. She stood, her knees slightly trembling, but she didn't falter. Dererick turned toward her, his face betraying nothing but a subtle, almost imperceptible relief. He had known something was different about her since the day he first found her, but now, he could see it. He could see that she was no longer the fragile being she once was. She was becoming something else. Lyra took a slow step toward him, her gaze steady, her expression determined. "What now?" she asked, her voice steady, no longer uncertain. "What do we do?" Dererick exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Now we get ready," he said, his voice low but with a quiet urgency. "We can't keep running forever. We'll have to face whatever comes. Together." His words hung in the air between them, charged with a silent promise. Lyra looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, but found none. He was ready. He was willing to fight for her, and that was all she needed to know. For once, she wasn't alone. And neither of them was going to back down. The storm outside had subsided, but the world still felt on edge. The faintest light began to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the broken landscape of Sector 8. The once bleak surroundings seemed to glow with a newfound energy. It was as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen, something to change. And Lyra knew, in that moment, that it was time. She crossed the room, heading for the small storage unit in the corner. She opened it, and her eyes scanned the contents: old tools, supplies, a few makeshift weapons. She knew this wasn't enough to face the real threat that loomed outside their shelter, but it was a start. She pulled out a blaster, examining it carefully before looking back at Dererick. "How do we use this?" she asked. Dererick moved toward her, his eyes catching hers for a brief second before he focused on the weapon in her hand. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers as he adjusted the blaster, showing her how to hold it. "You've got the basics," he said, his voice soft. "Just focus. Don't aim with your fear. Aim with your will." Lyra nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had come this far, and she was done hiding. She could feel the power that surged within her, something awakened, something powerful and dangerous. She wasn't just the girl who had been abandoned. She was someone who could fight back. Outside, a low, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears. The familiar hum of engines. It was too quiet. Too calculated. "They're coming," Dererick said quietly. "We can't hide anymore." Lyra turned to face him, the blaster now held firmly in her hand, the weight of the decision she had made settling deep in her chest. She had chosen her path. There was no turning back now. "Let's do it," she said, her voice sharp with determination. They moved toward the door together, Dererick's hand resting briefly on her shoulder before he stepped ahead, opening it slowly. The faint glow of the storm's aftermath illuminated the broken streets outside. The air smelled of metal and dust, the remnants of destruction clinging to everything. But there was something else now, a promise of change, of defiance. Lyra stepped out into the dim light, her heart pounding in her chest, but no longer out of fear. She felt alive. Her fingers tightened around the blaster. There was no more hesitation. No more doubt. In the distance, the first of the patrols appeared, two heavily armored figures, moving with purpose, scanning the area. But Lyra wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The battle was about to begin, but this time, she was ready to fight for her freedom, for her future. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't running. Lyra's breath came in sharp, controlled gasps as she crouched behind the crumbled remains of a once proud structure. Her pulse was a steady thrum in her ears, but her hands were steady, her fingers curled tightly around the blaster's grip. She had made a promise to herself and to Dererick. There would be no more running. Dererick was behind her, his back pressed against a wall, scanning the area with military precision. They had positioned themselves strategically. There was no going back now. The figures in the distance, the ones she had seen earlier, had stopped moving. They were waiting for something, too. "Keep your eyes sharp," Dererick murmured, his voice low, yet strong. "They won't be expecting us to fight back." Lyra nodded, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the adrenaline pumping through her veins, the sharp clarity of the moment cutting through the chaos. She had been through so much, had seen so much destruction, felt so much pain, but none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the here and now. The ground beneath them rumbled faintly, the sound of more engines approaching. They were not alone anymore. Reinforcements had arrived. The storm had passed, but the real battle was just beginning. Lyra's eyes flicked back to Dererick, and for a moment, she saw something in his gaze, something that mirrored her own resolve. He had been her anchor, the one person who had shown her kindness when no one else had. She had spent so much time afraid of what she could become, afraid of the power inside her, but now she understood. "I'm ready," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The moment she spoke, the silence was shattered. A series of loud bangs echoed through the ruined streets as the first shots were fired from the approaching soldiers. The battle had begun. Lyra moved without thinking, her body responding on instinct. The blaster in her hand was an extension of her will, her movements fluid as she fired off a round, hitting one of the advancing soldiers square in the chest. The figure crumpled to the ground, and she didn't stop. Her heart was steady, her aim true. Behind her, Dererick moved just as quickly, taking cover and returning fire with precision. They were a team now, unspoken, but effective. Every movement was synchronized, every action calculated. But as the smoke cleared, something else became apparent. They weren't just fighting soldiers, they were fighting for their very survival. Another group of figures appeared, emerging from the shadows. They were different, taller, stronger. Their movements were unnervingly precise, as though they knew exactly how to take down their enemies. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. These weren't just regular soldiers. "Get down!" Dererick shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her to the ground just as a burst of energy tore through the air, grazing the edge of her coat. They scrambled for cover again, but Lyra could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. These soldiers were relentless. They had no mercy. But she wasn't going to let them take everything from her. "You're not alone in this anymore," she muttered to herself, her grip tightening on the blaster. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a fighter. With a swift motion, she popped up from behind cover and fired again, hitting another soldier dead center. The rest of them scattered, but they weren't retreating. They were regrouping. "We need to get out of here, now." Dererick's voice rang through the air. Lyra didn't need to be told twice. She turned, grabbing his hand and pulling him along as they moved swiftly toward the exit. The ruins around them seemed to close in, the walls shifting, the ground beneath them trembling as explosions rocked the street. The soldiers were closing in, but they wouldn't stop, not until they were both dead. But Lyra wasn't done. She wasn't about to lose everything again. The pair found themselves at the edge of the ruins, staring down a narrow alleyway. The end of the road was near, and Lyra knew this was it, the final stand. With one last glance at Dererick, she stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. She had fought too hard, too long to let it all slip away now. The wind howled in her ears, but her heart was steady. She was ready for this. The soldiers charged forward, weapons raised. Lyra turned, the last blast of her blaster cutting through the air, and she smiled to herself. For once in her life, she wasn't afraid. The battle raged on, but this was their fight. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for a future. Together. In the end, love wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't the moment of a grand gesture or an epic kiss. It was much more subtle, much more profound. Because the universe doesn't care about your happiness. The stars? They're cold, indifferent, watching as people struggle to make sense of their existence. But between the chaos, between the silence of a forgotten world, they found something. Something not even the stars could extinguish. They broke every law in the galaxy, defied the rules of biology, physics, and fate itself. But the truth? It wasn't about who they were or where they came from. It was about where they were going and who they would become together. But the questions still linger. The galaxy is vast. Will they be able to keep what they've found in the face of an unrelenting, unforgiving universe? Or will they lose each other, the way so many others had? We've seen their beginning, but what about the end? Was this the start of something eternal, or just a brief moment in time? And if it's eternal, who will stop them? As the last star in the sky begins to fade, so does the story. But remember, love isn't just something you find. It's something you fight for. And sometimes, the biggest fight isn't against the universe, it's against the shadows of your past. Before you go, take a moment and ask yourself, can love truly survive the edges of the universe? Or will it be the galaxy's biggest lie? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Because the journey's just begun, and the answers, they're out there waiting.